I feel like it's been a really long time since I've vlogged, but I just wanted to come on today and ramble about like a theory, just this idea that I've had rolling around in my head for a while. Back when I was in school, I came across some research about, how families approached the sex ed conversation in their homes and with their kids. And something I remember reading was that, first of all, I remember reading that mothers were significantly more likely to take the lead on, teaching their kids about sexuality and having those conversations with their kids. And then something else that I read was that when there was a father at home, and if the father was having those sort of sexual conversations with their kids, particularly their teens, that dads tended to focus more on things like healthy relationships and tended to talk more specifically and overtly about sex itself and specifically sexual pleasure, while moms were more likely to talk to their kids about things like sexual health and specifically like sexual safety stuff. So, the importance of using contraception, or the importance of talking about, or the importance of practicing safer sex. So in my work, I encourage people to be open with youth about sexual pleasure and to incorporate it into the sex ed they're doing at home, particularly if they have teenagers. I think that knowing what feels good for you and knowing what doesn't feel good and having tools to communicate about that and prioritizing and respecting what does and doesn't feel good for other people is actually an incredibly important part of being able to experience your sexuality in positive ways as you move through your life. Something I've observed, and this is just an observation, it's like strictly anecdotal, is that sometimes when I introduce this concept of incorporating sexual pleasure into, a general sex ed strategy, that some mothers in particular will be a little bit wary about it. And what I've also noticed in myself is that even when I do that in my own family and I, do it in ways that are well researched and I know what I'm doing, like this is my job, I understand like the benefits and the risks and whatnot. Even when I move to do it and I'm like, everything I've read and studied tells me that this is, probably a positive way to go, I sometimes do have this sort of like instinctive, like fear or I start second guessing everything that I know anytime, well not anytime, but oftentimes when I want to tell my son something around sexuality that isn't an explicit like warning or setting some kind of a boundary. Anyway, as I said, I have a theory about why this might be, or at least what part of the reason might be, and I think it might be connected to the way a lot of women in our society are taught to think about sexual pleasure, specifically our own sexual pleasure. Growing up as a girl with a vulva, TMI about my anatomy, maybe, I was curious about my body when I was really young, and I explored and I touched myself and I discovered masturbation and I discovered it felt really good and I, would do it on the regular. And I mostly did it when I was in my room on my own, but every once in a while, like my parents would see me doing it and they would just, they didn't make a big deal about it, but they were like, stop doing that, and it wasn't like stop doing it because I can see you. It was just like stop doing it, period. Now, like I said, they weren't really harsh or didn't make a big deal about it, but I have certainly over the years spoken to, dozens and dozens of women who had the experience of their parents catching them masturbating and being told something like, oh, that's not nice, or that's gross, or, that's not something nice little girls do and stop it. And that really sort of sinking in. In addition to that, as a little girl, or again, a little girl with a vulva, I certainly remember at least being like aware that there was some conversation happening around penises. Like we all knew that, we were taught that boys had them, and that they were interested in them. And, it was kind of like this like joke thing, boys have a penis. But there's never any discussion of like girls or people with vulvas or vulvas at all. Like that was just not a word that would pop up ever. So even as a little girl, I think for me at least, I got this very subtle message that, what I had going on, like with my genitals and whatever, was just kind of off limits and at best not to be discussed, and at worst it was like kind of dirty and shameful and taboo. Then as I got older and I became a teenager, what I remember is that there suddenly was focus on my sexuality. I'm gonna put that in quotes, because what it really was this focus on my body, but not how my body felt. It was very much a focus on what my body looked like. And then a lot of my social instruction as it related to my sexuality was not only like how did I look, like what was my physical appearance, but it was what do other people think of my physical appearance. So a lot of what I got from TV and magazines and, even, interacting with my peers and in some cases certain members of my family was that my sexuality was very much tied up in things like my weight and my size and my skin tone and my hair texture and the clothes I chose to wear and, if I was wearing makeup and how I did my makeup. And it was all filtered through this lens of what do other people think about this? So I remember, reading in magazines or, watching television shows that were trying to promote like this certain like early, like really rough brand of body positivity. And so there was this very popular narrative that went, oh, women are always worried that they're too fat. But you shouldn't be worried about that because, when we ask women how they perceive their own body size, and then we ask a group of men how they perceive those same women and their body size, the men totally think or perceive the women as being thinner than the women perceive themselves. So like, don't stress because you're not as fat as you think you are. First of all, that's a bunch of fat phobic garbage, so blah. But also, it's still this message that is ostensibly about empowering women, but still tells them that their sexual desirability is dependent on how other people are evaluating them. And so what I learned growing up was that sexy was basically getting the person that I was interested in to see me and approve of my external presentation. What I didn't get were like lessons or messages or instructions about, thinking about how I felt in my body and how I felt about my body and paying attention to the different physical, emotional cues my body was giving me and questioning, what I did and didn't want to do with someone. It was all very much, you need to behave according to the rules and the boundaries and the allowances that other people will give you. This was as innocuous as something like my high school's dress code, which I know is still a really big issue today. So my high school's dress code very much honed in on restricting, ways of dressing that would have been more typical of a feminine style of dress. We couldn't have any garments that were shorter than the length of our fingertips. Well, that's usually going to be skirts. You weren't allowed to have a visible bra strap. Well, who typically wears bras? It's usually girls. You had to cover up any cleavage. Again, who usually has breasts and cleavage? Usually it's the girls. And the rationale for all of this was that you didn't want to be distracting to people, to other people. Well, even though I don't recall it being explicitly stated in the dress code that was like laid out in our agenda, we could all figure out what that meant. It was, okay, girls, you can't distract the boys with your body because the boys will get horny and won't be able to work. So again, it normalizes this idea that horniness is a thing that boys experience, but apparently if you were a girl, you don't have hormones or genitals or sexual arousal, that you are basically just this collection of walking body parts that trigger sexual arousal in boys. And even a lot of, romance or erotic fiction that is supposed to be aimed at women is based on the premise of this, inexperienced, very young, sort of innocent, woman being sexually awakened by a more sophisticated, highly experienced sexual dude. Like 50 Shades was based on that entire premise, that we don't have our own sexual agency or desires. It's just this sort of latent passive thing that can be triggered when some guy who's super good at sex comes along and kind of, turns us on. Like, that's the phrase, right? And I'm not trying to shade you if 50 Shades or that style of erotica is what turns you on or what you enjoy in fantasy on any level. Like, we all like what we like. I'm just trying to point out that historically in our culture, there just hasn't been a lot that normalizes the idea that as girls and women, we have our own set of sexual desires, that we, experience sexual arousal in our bodies, sort of independently of anyone else's approval or direction. And then I think that that has had a real impact on how we view sexuality as a whole and how we talk about it with our kids. If we've been taught for decades that sexual pleasure or our sexual pleasure is this highly fraught experience that, is defined by others, and we can only engage with it in these very passive ways when other people kind of give us permission to do that, then it makes sense to me that a lot of us are gonna feel some kind of way about talking to our kids about sexual pleasure. So anyway, that is my theory, which may or may not resonate with you, depending on your own experience. Either way, if you have thoughts about it or you have an alternative theory that you want to share, then yeah, definitely, let me know down in the comments. I would love to read what you think. Also, I'm going to link to that research I mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to link to that in the description box. So if you want to geek out with some, academic sex info, go nuts. That's it. Vlog done. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye.